Welcome to Bass Conversations, Episode 2, with Stephen Mooney from Constructing Walking Jazz Bass Lines. Today I'm going to be talking about transcribing, and I'm also going to be looking at how to construct walking bass lines. Walking bass lines. One of the questions that I get asked a lot through my website and also from my students is, how do I get started putting my own bass lines together? Walking lines on the blues or standards or things like that. Well, the first thing that I do when I'm looking at a new tune is I want to analyze the tune and know what the form is. I want to know if it's an AABA form, maybe it's an AABC type form, or maybe it's just straight up blues. That's something that you want to look at before you start thinking about putting a line together. The next thing that I do is I try to analyze what's happening with the chord sequence. I want to try to find out if the tune is starting on a four chord, for example. A good example of that it would be the tune Just Friends. It starts on the four chord. By being able to identify things like that, makes it easier for you to make informed choices about what scales you're going to be using, as an example. One of the progressions that I've done a lot of work on, and I've done a lot of work on building lines from this progression, would be the blues. There's a lot can be gained by having a strong understanding of what's happening with the blues. And one thing that I try to explain to my students is that if you can play really good lines on the blues and you understand the chord substitutions that are available on the blues, you can basically open the rule book up and play 70 to 80% of the tunes from the rule book just by understanding how to walk lines on the blues. Now, a lot of people might be thinking, well, what do you really mean by that? Well, the blues contains a lot of different chord sequences. For example, if we look at the basic blues progression, it would be a one dominant chord going to the four dominant chord, back to the one, and then there's going to be some sort of a turnaround that is going to lead us to the final turnaround to bring us back to the top. So what you might be looking at is going to the one chord and then a 2-5, which is going to lead to the 2-5 back to the 1-6-2-5. So if we were in the key of F, then the last half of the blues may be a progression that would look or sound something like this: F7, going to A minor 7, D7, going to G minor 7, C7, and then into some sort of turnaround based around a 1-6-2-5, which would be F7, D7, G minor 7, C7. So that starts to sound like a lot of different chord changes. A minor 7, D7, G minor 7, C7, then you're going into a 1-6-2-5. But if we think about that, then what's actually happening is we have a 3-6-2-5 in the key of F. A minor would be the third mode of F, the D7 would be the sixth mode, the G minor would be the second mode, and the C7 would be the fifth mode. All these scales and all these chords are related to the tonic key, which in the blues example that I gave was F7. Now, by being able to understand these sequences and be able to recognize them, it makes it a lot easier to make a decision about what sort of chords or scales you're going to be using over a given progression. And this is where it relates to opening the rule book and being able to play on standards. Now, the blues contains many different sequences. Once you start getting into tritone substitution, you get a lot of chromatic root movement in the blues. You have 3-6-2-5, and then you have, secondary dominants. there's a lot of mileage which can be gained by understanding how to play the blues. Now, I've actually written a book. It's called The Blues in 12 Keys, and I talk about a lot of these exercises and a lot of being able to recognize things and the importance of being able to recognize things and just do them on the fly. So let's think about putting a line together on a basic blues. We'll play the standard blues progression in the key of F, and we'll be using a jazz blues. I'm going to be linking some exercises to this podcast related to building some lines on the blues. So the first thing I would suggest is making sure that you understand the progression. So what I would do is I would get myself a piece of manuscript and I would write out the chord progression. So the chord progression that we might use is F7 for 1 bar, B flat 7 for 1 bar, F7 for 1 bar, C minor 7, F7 for 1 bar, going to B flat 7 for 2 bars. Then we're going to go back to the tonic F7 for 1 bar. Then we're going to play an A minor 7, D7 in 1 bar, G minor 7 for 1 bar, C7 for 1 bar, and then a 1, 6, 2, 5 in the key of F for the last 2 bars. Now, once we have that, the first thing that I would do for a beginning player is I would just do some root to fifth motion. Okay, so I'm going to put some exercises linked to this exercise with some root, fifth, and octave type bass lines. Now, Wilbur Ware, a great bassist, used to use the intervals of root, fifth, and octaves a lot. And he would get some really swinging lines just from those 3 notes, root, fifth, octave, and then he would add things like the 7th, whether that be a flattened 7th or a major 7th, and the 3rd. So once we have, for example, the intervals of the root, the 3rd, and the 5th, what we have then is a triad, and that is the second stage that I would go to when learning about how to walk solid lines. The good thing about a triad, just the 3 notes of the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the octave, is that immediately you're outlining the harmony of the tune. Okay, so that puts you into a strong situation of providing a good roadmap for the melody and or the soloist. With just those 3 notes, you're defining whether the chord changes are minor and major, minor or major. It's very important. It's very important to be clear on what it is you're saying. When you're walking lines and you're playing, extended amount of choruses behind a soloist, you've got to make it very clear as to what it is that you're saying. And what that does is it makes it more coherent for the rest of the members of the band. So you can really get into some extended blowing on tunes by being able to walk consistent lines that outline the harmony using just the simple intervals of 1, 3, 5. I'm going to be adding an example of some blues lines in F just using triads. So just to recap on how to go about putting together some simple bass lines on a blues. So what I suggested firstly was to write out a chord progression and to be able to understand the various sequences in the tune. So for example, the blues has the movement of 1 going to 4 going back to 1. Quite often there's a 2-5 going to the 4 chord, and then we go back to the one chord. Then we have an extended turnaround, which is basically 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, 6, 2, 5. So identify the changes. Then what I suggest is writing out a simple line, could be a two feel, where you're just using the root, the fifth, and the octave. And maybe you would want to write out a couple of choruses like that. And then go into a walking feel, which would be 4/4 notes to the bar, just using triads. When you can do that for a couple of choruses, two or three choruses of triads and quarter notes, you then have a strong foundation of a bass line that goes over the blues, that swings and outlines the harmony. Once you're there, that's a great building block for building more complicated lines. But what I like to remind my students is that if you don't have a basic understanding of what's happening, it's very hard to go into more complex and more complicated lines. The most important part is to be able to outline the foundation of the chord changes. It's very important, very important. Transcribing. Transcribing is another very important aspect for all musicians, but especially for a jazz bass player. You know, there's many advantages of transcribing tunes or working on a transcription that has been done by somebody else. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. But what I would suggest is being able to transcribe your own parts. You know, for beginning players, it's not always easy to transcribe bass lines. Depending on the recording and the era that you're trying to get the bass line from, a lot of the times the bass line can be buried in the mix. You know, that's one of the things about trying to transcribe a bass line. It's not really up front, like, for example, a piano solo or a saxophone solo. But with technology, you know, there's a lot of advantages around now that weren't around for people that were trying to get the stuff off the records. You know, as an example, it's, you know, you could basically slow the record down, or you could try to get it at speed, which, you know, it's not easy. But one thing is, once you get a little bit, it does tend to get easier. But nowadays, with the transcribing software that's around, it is a lot easier to transcribe. So, what I would suggest is finding a tune or finding a bass line that you can really identify with, and you think, wow, you know, I'd really like to learn that bass line and find out what's happening. So what you would do is you would put it into a transcribe program like Super Slowdown or something like that, and then you would loop the passage that it is that you're trying to work out. And what happens is you can isolate maybe one bar or two bars at a time and just get it note by note. And then what you will find is after X amount of time, you will have a chorus down. So once you have a chorus or two choruses of the line down, then a good idea is to think, I'm going to work out what it is that the player is playing. Okay, I mean, I've transcribed a lot of Wilbur Ware. I've transcribed a lot of bass players, but I've transcribed a lot of Wilbur Ware, and it made a big difference in my playing. You know, there's no question that I've been heavily influenced by the players like, you know, Wilbur and Paul Chambers, Herbie Lewis. You know, I definitely owe them a lot. But just getting back to the transcribing, what I did when I transcribed the Wilbur Ware lines was I got then I compared the lines that he was playing to the standard chord changes on of the tune. And then you start to think, okay, so he's playing whatever sequence that might be. Something that Wilbur plays a lot, and I mentioned it before in this podcast, is he plays around a lot on the root, the fifth, and the octave, and he varies, the sequence of the intervals. He does a lot of other stuff, but that's something that he does, and he does it very well. And the way he puts the line together, it really swings. But what you want to do is you want to analyze the line. And then, as you start to transcribe more and more players and analyze their playing, what you begin to realize is that the lines that they're playing are very similar. I mean, to outline the chord changes, it's a limited amount of notes that are going to be used to outline the chord changes clearly. Especially on something like a 2-5-1, you really want to be using 1, 3, 5, and 7. So with a limited amount of notes like that, there is a big variation between the sound of the bass lines of somebody like Wilbur Ware, for example, or Paul Chambers, or Ray Brown, or Ron Carter. They're basically using the same intervals or the same scales to build their lines, but the difference in their sound can be vast. There's a big difference between Wilbur Ware and Ray Brown, or Ray Brown and Ron Carter. They're all spectacular players. They're historical bass players, but it's amazing what they can do and how different they can sound by using the same set of notes. And that's what I say to my students all the time, is that you want to have a distinctive sound. You want to have a sound that is recognizable, so that when somebody hears the bass playing, they say, that's Wilbur Ware, or that's Ray Brown. And the way that they do that is that they have studied the music, they worked out how to outline the chord changes, and then the rest of it is their musical experience and their personality. That's what goes into the lines to make the lines swinging and to make the lines distinctive, so that the lines have an identity. It's an identity of Ray Brown, or Wilbur, or Paul Chambers. The good thing about transcribing your own lines, whether that be bass lines or solo lines from, say, a trumpet player or a saxophone player, is it not only does it give you vocabulary, but you get to hear the music in context. And that's something that often gets missed if you're using a transcription that somebody else has done. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the advantages of being able to transcribe your own lines is that you're really learning the music at a much deeper level. It can be difficult, it can be frustrating, especially for a beginning player, and if the line is buried in the mix, as an example. But the things that you gain from it is, it's a fantastic ear training exercise. That is one of the biggest benefits from doing your own transcribing. And the other advantage is it makes you find things on your instrument that you may not have looked at before. Both of those things combined together can give you a huge leap forward in your playing, especially when you are encountering hitting a wall. In the last podcast, I talked a little bit about that, hitting the wall. That is something that can be overcome by doing things such as transcribing and working on ear training and playing piano. I was just talking about transcribing your own lines and how you hear the lines in context, and how important that is. One thing that I hear sometimes, with beginning players or with my students, is They may have been practicing a transcription that they got from a book, or they got it off the internet or something like that. And they learn the line, and it's a great line. But if you haven't heard the recording of the music, you don't really know what's happening in context. You don't know what's happening with the line. So maybe, you might be playing this walking bass line, and all of a sudden there's an extended triplet figure or something like that. Now, without actually hearing the original version of the tune, you're not really sure why the bass player has made that decision to play this extended figure of triplets. Normally, what's happening is, if you're playing behind a melody or a soloist and you hear a figure like that, it's because there's a gap, and you're filling a gap and you're propelling the music forward. Now, if you have somebody that's a soloist or a melody, and they're playing a particular rhythm, then there's a pretty good chance that figure, that extended triplet figure that you've got from a recording, is not going to fit. But because you practiced the transcription over and over again, and you've memorized it, you're just going to kind of throw that in there without even thinking about it, and that is not really musical. That's not a musical choice. That's something that is really based around muscle memory, and it's questionable whether that is actually going to be suitable for the melody or beneficial for the soloist that you're playing behind. I mean, one thing that you really want to be thinking clearly about when you're playing walking bass lines, or you're accompanying anybody in any style of music, is, are you supporting the melody rhythmically and harmonically, or are you providing the sort of foundation to the soloist that you would like to have if you were the person soloing? That's a big thing that you want to be thinking about. Now, if you have done a transcription yourself and you are listening to the music, you will have a greater understanding of why the person has played this particular rhythmic figure at that particular time. If you're just looking at a piece of music that somebody else has transcribed, then you're missing a big part of the picture. And that's why transcribing yourself is much more beneficial than getting a transcription from somebody else and trying to plug that in at your next gig. And you hear a lot of beginning players do that. One thing that I would suggest when using transcriptions done by other people is, the first thing you want to do is check out the recording. Listen to the recording and read along with the transcription, and then you will know why the player has played specific lines or specific rhythmic patterns. And then the next point that I would make is, now that you have that line and you have the tune, I would analyze the line and work out what chords or what intervallic sequences the bass player is using to outline the chord changes. That's the way to really get the most out of a transcription. Analyze the transcription, figure out if they're using any chord substitutions. Are they playing ahead of the changes? Are they playing behind the changes? These are the things that you want to be looking at when you're doing transcribing. And that is something that makes a big difference to your playing. And that's the sort of thing that people hear. They hear the difference between somebody that is doing their own transcriptions and somebody that has maybe heard a transcription somewhere, learnt it, and then they're trying to just plug it in anywhere. Jazz bucket list. The next thing I want to talk about today is creating a bucket list of albums. Now, I mentioned in the previous podcast, I like to make lists as a means to make progress. And I think, a good thing to do is to make a bucket list of classic jazz recordings. And what that can do is, if you're having a period of, hitting a wall or losing inspiration, you can go back to this list and get some inspiration from that. So today I'm going to be getting started with the list, and I'll be adding to it as I move forward with the program with the podcasts. So the first album that's on my bucket list is Giant Steps, and I spoke about the importance of that album in my first podcast. But I think for a lot of reasons, Giant Steps it's a landmark recording. There's no question. There's no question about it. The next album that I would recommend is an album called Coltrane Sound by John Coltrane. This features obviously John Coltrane on tenor. It has Elvin Jones on drums, McCoy Tyner on piano, and Steve Davis playing bass. And this is a great record where Coltrane reharmonizes standards using the Coltrane matrix. And there's some classic versions here of tunes like Body and Soul, and a contrafact called Satellite, which is based on the changes to How High the Moon, and his tune 26-2, which is a contrafact on Charlie Parker's tune Confirmation. And Coltrane plays that one on tenor and soprano. It's a fantastic album, and I would recommend definitely checking that one out. Two more records that I'll recommend today. The next one is by hardbop piano player Sonny Clark, and the record is Cool Struttin'. This is a great album featuring Sonny Clark on piano, Jackie McLean on alto, Art Farmer on trumpet, Paul Chambers on bass, and Philly Joe Jones playing drums. This is a swinging album. I can remember putting this on the CD player in my car, and that CD didn't get taken out of the car for like 12 months. I just played that record over and over and over again, listening to the playing. There's a great track on the album called Blue Miner. It's a really hard swinging album. There's no better way to put it than that. The next album that I'd like to recommend is an album by tenor man Steve Grossman. And the record that I'm suggesting that you check out is My Second Prime. Steve Grossman does a tune on this record called Extemporaneous. It's like an up-tempo hard bop piece, and the playing by Steve Grossman on this record is, it's first-rate playing all around. Steve Grossman is, he's at the top of the tree as far as tenor saxophone playing goes. There's no two ways about it. So I would definitely check out that. My Second Prime by Steve Grossman. So just to recap today about the things we looked at, we talked about the importance of transcribing, and we talked about putting some walking bass lines together. Now, as I mentioned, I'll be putting some links on my website related to the walking bass exercises, so that if anybody is interested, they can go to my website, constructingwalkingjazzbasslines.com, and just look at the podcast link, and I will be putting up some information related to the podcast. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast. If there's anybody out there listening, I am available for online bass lessons. I've taught a lot of students from all around the world using this method, and It's the same method that I used when I was studying with Charlie Bonacos. I mean, at the time I was in New York. Charlie Bonacos, who is, he's a cult figure in jazz education. He was living in Massachusetts at the time, and we basically sent recordings to one another. And that is the system that I am using. I'm not using Charlie's lessons. I'm using my own lessons that's related to bass playing and jazz improv. But the system of sending tapes back and forwards or MP3s back and forwards is a system that I've used, and it's a system that has worked very well for a lot of people. So if there's anybody out there listening to the podcast that would be interested, please contact me through the email address on my website, constructingwalkingjazzbasslines.com. Thank you very much for listening today, and I will look forward to talking to you in the next podcast. Thanks.